Chapter 11. On the Eve of the Offensive. Since my arrival in the Crimea, I had been working 10 or 12 hours a day, and I expected my colleagues to do the same. My day began at 7 o'clock a.m. At 8 o'clock, I received the Chief of Staff, the Commander of the Fleet, the Chief of the Military Administration, and any other visitors. This went on until 1 o'clock, when I dined. From 2 o'clock till 6, I received reports from other branches of the administration, and between 6 and 8, when I had supper, I nearly always fitted in interviews with people who had come to Sebastopol and with whom I wanted to have long talks, people such as representatives of the Allied missions and so on. On the very few days when I had a free hour before supper, I used to go round the town with my aide-de-camp and visit the hospitals and houses of refuge. In the evening, I attended the meeting of the Council of the Directors of the Administration, or read dispatches, or attended to my vast correspondence. I never went to bed until 11 o'clock or midnight. During the first week or so, visitors were especially numerous. They came to see me about the most trifling questions. On 2 occasions, I even had to deal with lunatics. On one occasion, I was told that there was an engineer, a naval mechanic, amongst the list of visitors. He wanted to see me about his invention, which, he said, had considerable importance at the present stage of the war. The inventor would not share his secret with anyone but the commander-in-chief. I received him. He was quite a young man and looked puny and ill. He seemed very excited. I invited him to sit down and told him I had heard of his invention and wanted to know what it was. "Your Excellency, I would not have troubled you at all did I not believe that my invention could be useful to you, especially now that you are having such difficulties. Treason is prowling all round you, and you can trust no one. This simple instrument that I have invented can be of enormous service to you. It is a kind of compass. You can fix it to a corner of your desk so that it is invisible. Now suppose you are talking to someone about whom you know very little. You just press the button of my instrument, quite imperceptibly, and the needle will show you on this screen who the person is, whether he is a Germanophile, a supporter of the Entente, a Bolshevist, a Democrat, or a monarchist. I have all the rough sketches of the instrument here." And he began to open his portfolio. Another time, the manager of an officers' cooperative society, an old retired colonel, was among the visitors. He explained the object of his visit very clearly and in great detail. I promised to help him, and as I was saying goodbye, I asked him where he had served previously. "In the old days, I was an instructor at a military school in Petrograd." He mentioned its name. I had the good fortune to show the Tsarevich over our museum. After a moment's silence, he leant over to me and continued in a mysterious manner. "How he has grown, Your Excellency! I would not have known him the last time I saw him. He is taller than I am. He is quite well and cheerful. The Tsar and the Grand Duchesses are also well, thank God." "Where and when did you last see the imperial family?" "Well, it was last year at Rostov. I was walking along the Sadovaya when suddenly I saw the Tsar in ordinary clothes. I scarcely recognized him. He greeted me, and later I called on him several times and saw him, the Tsarina, and their children. I had difficulty in changing the subject, but as soon as we began talking of something else, the colonel became perfectly normal again." The 12th, 15th, and 16th Soviet armies had been beaten by the Poles and were retreating all along the front without putting up any resistance. For several weeks, the Poles, backed up by Petliora's Ukrainian formations, had been sweeping over an immense territory, extending from Polotsk on the Drina to the upper reaches of the Dnieper, the Kiev region, and a large part of the right bank of the Ukraine. The Red Command were throwing all their reserves onto the Western Front as a remedy for their disastrous situation. The cavalry were the first to be transferred. The First Army, under Comrade Boudeni, was moved from Caucasia. It was the strongest of all the Red Cavalry formations. They even transferred the only cavalry division on the Crimean front to the southwest Polish front. The railways in South Russia had not yet been repaired after our retreat, so the transporting of the Red troops was a slow business, for they used the high roads. At the same time, the fact that we had seized the Crimean passes had shown that the remains of the Russian army had not lost all their military prowess. Also, the intensive military reorganization and the re-establishment of order in the Crimea had not escaped the attention of the Red Command, and although they were devoting all their attention to the Polish campaign, they no longer disregarded the menace in the Crimea. As early as April, they had begun to send reinforcements for the 13th Army. By May, its effectives had risen to 12,000 bayonets and 3,000 sabers. A staff colonel, the Let Pauka, had been put at the head of the 13th Army. The Bolshevists were proceeding with intensive fortification works all along the front. The fortified positions were furnished with large quantities of artillery. Information came through concerning the Bolshevists' behind-the-line organizations and the repairing of the railways at the front. By May, the Russian army was already a considerable force. The total number of combatants at the front, in reserve and behind the lines, was 40,000 men. All those who were fit to fight were in regiments. The material equipment had been put in order. We had 10 tanks and 21 aeroplanes, although they were old models and all of different types. Fortification works were in progress all along the front. The troops had been able to rest and recuperate. All the units were being drilled. The general strategic situation had become more favorable for us. Not only could we set our minds at rest over the fate of the Crimea for some time to come, but we could again come to blows with the enemy. The difficult economic situation would not allow us to remain in the Crimea much longer. It became of vital importance that we should find an outlet into the rich southern districts of northern Taurida. This move, should it succeed, would have a favorable repercussion on our political situation. On April 30th, the forcible requisition of 4,000 horses at a price fixed beforehand was ordered. For this purpose, the Crimea was divided into 5 sections corresponding to the 5 districts. The actual purchase of the horses was made by remounts commissions, one for each district. With the horses thus bought, we were able to supply the artillery and part of the transport and mount a cavalry regiment 400 strong. On May 15th, the mobilization of recruits born in 1900 or 1901 was ordered. In anticipation of the resumption of military operations, and because I attached special importance to questions affecting the railway transport of troops and the regular running of the food trains, I put the management of all the railways into the hands of the Chief of Military Communications. I had cause to congratulate myself on this measure later. Simultaneously with these military orders, I was issuing a series of measures for the civil administration. A temporary statute concerning chiefs of the civil branch and Army Corps commanders was promulgated on May 11th. It gave an advance guarantee that regular administrative machinery would be set up immediately after occupation of new territory by our troops, and that a check would be put upon the arbitrary whims of military chiefs who were often completely ignorant of their work. Henceforth, the general administration of the freed territories was to be controlled by the Army Corps commanders through the chiefs of the civil branch, who were to have the powers of provincial governors. Such a chief of the civil branch was to be directly responsible to the Army Corps commander for the government of his district, and was to receive his general instructions from the chief of the civil administration. Within the Army Corps' area, he was to see that the district chiefs and the personnel of the town and country police forces, which were responsible to him, the circuit chiefs, and the inspectors of the volosts, worked together. He had to organize the town and country police in the newly occupied territories, working through the district chiefs. At the service of the chief of the civil branch were the plenipotentiaries of the finance, justice, commissariat, and agricultural departments. They had to carry out his instructions within their own spheres, receiving them as general instructions from the chiefs of their respective departments. This measure was later said to be very efficacious and useful. The police force was reorganized on a new basis. The Department for the Repression of Offenses Against the Common Law was separated from that for the repression of political offenses and was able to devote itself to its main task, the pursuit of common law criminals. The rumor in the press that all the refugees evacuated from Novorossiysk and Odessa were being recalled to the Crimea annoyed me very much. Some of these refugees were in a truly lamentable situation, especially those living on the desert island of Lemnos, where the rate of infant mortality was shockingly high. They wrote desperate letters from there, which aroused well-founded fears in the hearts of their relations. Russians are inclined to pass in one moment from complete depression to the most radiant optimism. Those who had said not long ago that the Crimea was a tomb now regarded it as an impregnable fortress. Every day, we received hundreds of demands and petitions, begging that such and such a person should be allowed to return to the Crimea. The columns of the newspapers were full of articles entitled, "Let us rejoin our families," "Will they never let us come back?" and so on. Although I quite understood that officers and officials could not keep their minds on their work if they were anxious about the fate of their nearest and dearest all the time, I also knew that our situation was not yet absolutely safe, and that the return of the refugees would only aggravate the crisis in the Crimea. Therefore, I put off the solution of this problem. Life behind the lines was gradually becoming more normal. Goods were coming in from abroad, shops, theaters, and cinemas were opening again. Sebastopol was becoming more like its old self, and order reigned there. The soldiers in the streets were properly dressed and never failed to give the military salute. At the end of April, I gave several dinners for the representatives of the foreign missions: English, French, American, Japanese, Serbian, and Polish, and accepted invitations to dine at the English, French, and Japanese missions. I was on the best of terms with the representatives of every mission. During my interviews with them, I always emphasized the importance of our fight, not only for Russia, but for all Europe, insisting that the menace of world Bolshevism was not yet over, and that Europe could not be easy in her mind so long as representatives of the International dwelt in Moscow, for they had set themselves the task of spreading their doctrine to all parts of the world. The economic equilibrium could not be reestablished so long as 1/6 of the globe had no access to the world market. Although I was taking every possible measure to enable us to continue the struggle, I did not for one moment forget how necessary it was to provide for the evacuation of the army and the populace in case of failure. I was determined to launch an offensive in the near future and wanted to do all I could in advance to frustrate the machinations of England, who most certainly wanted to prevent us doing so. At the same time, I wanted to be able to use our victory, should we achieve one, to gain the support of France. I requested P.B. Struve to return to Paris. On May 2nd, General Milne, commander of the English Army of Occupation, arrived in Sebastopol. He came to see me. The special object of his visit, he said, was to see for himself the results of the great reorganization in the army and behind the lines in the Crimea, of which his agents had told him. His personal impressions in Sebastopol, he added, had entirely confirmed everything that he had been told. During our interview, I touched on the difficult economic situation in the Crimea. The British government, which had taken the initiative in the negotiations with the Bolshevists, had not arrived at any definite result. Meanwhile, continued occupation of the Crimea would mean starvation for the army and the populace. Under these conditions, I could see no other course but to try and enlarge our territory. General Milne was obviously interested in what I said and attempted to investigate my intentions further, but I led the conversation into other channels. May 16th to 29th, General Percy, chief of the English military mission, sent me on the following note. British force to Percy Dennis. May 25th. You will send the following communication to General Wrangel in writing on behalf of the High Commissioner, and no conversations on this subject are to take place between you and General Wrangel. The British government instructs me to make it clear to General Wrangel that no change whatsoever is to be expected in British policy as a result of the Polish offensive. His Majesty's government is determined to endeavor to bring hostilities in South Russia to a close as soon as possible. The Soviet have accepted Britain's proposals for negotiations on the basis of a general amnesty, and Lord Curzon is replying that he is anxious for these negotiations to begin with as little delay as possible. the British government thinks that all negotiations should take place in South Russia. His Majesty's government has asked me what I consider is a suitable place, and I shall be glad of General Wrangel's opinion on this matter. I am instructed to explain to General Wrangel that he is not being left to negotiate alone with the Soviet government. Lord Curzon is sending out a political officer as soon as possible to assist General Wrangel. Meanwhile, the Soviet government has agreed to the participation of the British military representative. Ends. Acknowledge. British military mission, Sebastopol, May 29, 1920. To the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia, Your Excellency, the above telegram received from the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army of the Black Sea is forwarded for your information. Percy, Brigadier General, commanding English military mission. Whilst the English continued to seek a compromise with the Soviet government and insisted on the cessation of fighting, the French government, supporting Poland now as ever, had quite a different point of view. In General Mangin's interviews with M. Struve, his successor Prince Trubetskoy, and myself, he had more than once raised the question of eventual collaboration between our troops, the Poles, and Ukrainians. On 4 to 17th May, Prince Trubetskoy wrote to General Mangin, "You wished General Baron Wrangel to be informed that you would like to know his opinion on the question of eventual cooperation between the armed forces of South Russia and the Polish and Ukrainian armies. The Commander-in-Chief requests me to reply and acquaint you with the policy he has decided to adopt hereafter, should events lead him to consider such cooperation. General Wrangel wishes to state first of all that he does not want to broach the political side of the question, nor to take his stand on the recent news of the political agreement between Poland and the Ukraine. The aim of the armed forces of South Russia is the essentially practical and military one of fighting the Bolshevists. If this is clearly understood, the Commander-in-Chief is ready to accept all the collaboration which offers itself, and will be more than willing to cooperate with the Polish and Ukrainian forces. He thinks it advisable that each of the armies fighting the Bolshevists should be given definite zones of action, and suggests that the area bounded on the west by the Dnieper and on the north by the town of Ekaterinoslav would be the district in which the Russian armies could be of most use. It must be understood that to preserve good order in military spheres, the civil administration must be controlled by the military occupation authorities in each area. On May 21st, June 3rd, Admiral Hope arrived in the Crimea on board the English cruiser Cardiff. He sent me another note from the British government, HMS Cardiff, No. 335, June 3rd, 1920. I beg to inform you that I have received a message from the British High Commissioner at Constantinople directing me to inform you that HM government is a good deal disquieted by rumors of your intention to take the offensive against the Bolshevist forces. I am also directed to inform you that, if you attack, the scheme for negotiations with the Soviet government, conceived by HM government, will inevitably fall through, and HM government will be unable to concern itself any further with the fate of your army. I have the honor to be, sir, your obedient servant, G. Hope, Rear Admiral. To General Wrangel, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. I answered these two English notes on May 23rd, June 5th, in a letter to the British High Commissioner. I have had the honor of receiving two messages from Your Excellency. The first was sent to me by General Percy on May 16th, 20th, and the second by Admiral Hope on May 21st, June 3rd. I hasten to reply as follows. I still negative the idea of my participating directly in the negotiations with the Bolshevists, which the British government has undertaken. Therefore, it is for the British government to choose the place at which the interviews with the Soviets shall take place. Also, I have not yet received an answer to my telegram of April 11th to 24th, sent more than a month ago, in which I pointed out the necessity of using the resources of the southern parts of northern Taurida to feed my troops and the Crimean population. Force of circumstances now compels me to promulgate measures for the enlargement of the zone occupied by my army so that I may ward off a severe crisis. Before I received your last message, I ordered the army to launch an offensive to achieve this. Part of this offensive consists of a disembarkation which is already underway. It is obviously impossible to stop it. I like to believe that when HM government understands the situation and considers the new factors, it will realize that neither from the point of view of the commissariat question nor from the military standpoint had I the choice of any other course but an offensive. Should my army be victorious, it will help the British government enormously in its negotiations with the Soviets. There is also another essential consideration of a different nature, and I feel I ought to draw the attention of HM government to it. The very admission of the possibility of an entente with the Bolshevists renders the question of bona fide guarantees to ensure the honoring of the agreement very vague. I think it absolutely essential that they should be defined, and I would be extremely grateful to the British government if it would give me its opinion on this question. The recent examples of Bolshevist behavior in the Kuban and Georgia, with whose governments the Reds have just signed treaties, are sufficient exemplification of the well-known Bolshevist rule of regarding all judicial and moral obligations as so many bourgeois prejudices. In any case, I will allow myself to express the hope that so long as the primordial question of guarantees is not explicitly settled, the British government will not refuse me the support it promised, which is so precious to me. A.V. Krivotchain had a series of interviews with representatives of the French government just before he left Paris. Some of them were very old friends of his. As a result, the following letters passed between A.V. Krivotchain and M. Paleolog, Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs. On May 7th, A.V. Krivotchain wrote to M. Paleolog, "My dear Ambassador, I propose to leave for the Crimea in a few days' time. General Wrangel has summoned me for an interview. It would give me great pleasure were I in a position to assure him that he has the sympathies of the French government in the continuation of his fight against the Bolshevists, in which he would welcome the cooperation of the Poles and of any other force capable of taking part in the conflict. It would be very valuable to him if he knew for certain that authoritative circles in France recognize the importance of the existence of a piece of Russian territory, however small, on which normal government can be preserved for the future, a territory which remains faithful to the Allies and organizes a government on European principles of law and liberty, where non-Bolshevist Russian elements can find a natural refuge. It is no less essential that General Wrangel should be able to count on help from France in the form of war materials, and eventually, if it should prove impossible to continue the struggle, on French help in the evacuation of the Crimea." The next day, he received the following answer. Paris, May 8, 1920. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, General Secretariat. My dear Minister, I have not failed to submit your letter of yesterday to the President of the Council, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. I am pleased to be able to assure you that the French government recognizes the importance of a territory which has become the last refuge of Russian patriots and the only sanctuary for law and the Russian conscience. So long as General Wrangel lacks the necessary guarantees for the safety of his troops, we will endeavor to assist him with food and equipment with which to defend himself against Bolshevist attacks, whilst our Black Sea Fleet will continue to prevent any disembarkation on the shores of the Crimea. Finally, should further resistance become impossible, we will help with the evacuation in every possible way. With my very kindest regards, Pyotr. Krivotchain also had a series of interviews with Russian statesmen and politicians. M.N. Gears, the oldest member of the Russian diplomatic corps, V.A. Maklakov, who had been the provisional government's ambassador in Paris, Prince Lvov, A.I. Guchkov, Baron Nold, P.N. Milyukov, Adjemov, and many others. All of them except Guchkov tried to dissuade him from associating himself with the hopeless Crimean enterprise. Milyukov and others of his party put forward the following idea. In view of the smallness of the fragment of Russian territory to which the struggle was now confined, the commander-in-chief of the White forces should not speak in the name of the Russian nation. He ought to be the commander-in-chief of the White troops only, The Russian nation should be represented by a committee of Russian politicians resident in Paris, the center of European politics. Under these conditions, the fact that M. Krivochin agreed to become my adjutant naturally weakened their position, for he had considerable influence in foreign circles. His personal participation in our work would raise our prestige abroad, and this was not at all to the liking of those who considered themselves the salt of the Russian earth. You are the only statesman whose authority is recognized by all parties without exception. Your work is necessary for the future of Russia. If you associate yourself with General Wrangel's hopeless undertaking, which is practically a gamble, you will be lost to Russia forever, was Milyukov's argument. M. Krivochin saw a party of our compatriots once again before he left. Nearly all of them considered that our campaign was irreparably lost, and did not believe that it was possible for us to go on. They thought that all our efforts had been in vain. M. Krivochin was an experienced man and a judge of human nature, and he knew quite well that these doubters would support the army immediately if it won a success. Also, he fully realized what an effect a success, however short-lived, would have on the attitude of foreign powers, especially France. I kept him informed of all the details of our military situation and our preparations for the offensive. We expected great things from this, should it succeed. Yet M. Krivochin hesitated to believe in success. He warned me of the dangers of a risky operation. The offensive was to be launched on May 25th, June 7th. On the 21st, I left for Feodosia, where General Slakhov's Army Corps was to embark and undertake coastal operations. I had been in the Crimea 2 months. When I arrived there, the foul red wave was about to submerge the last strip of Russian ground, and hundreds of thousands of Russians who had been driven to the sea saw the end approaching. The remains of the army, which had been fighting for its country for 2 years, were rent by internal dissensions and had lost faith in their leaders. The military environment even was gone. Crowds of old men, women, and children were begging for help, terror-stricken, ragged, and starving. Death was stretching out its bony hand towards them. 2 months had gone by, and the Russian soldiers were united once more under their national flag. Our tricolor was raised from the dust again. The regiments were armed with bayonets and were defending their native soil with their bodies, ready to renew the struggle for its liberation. Under their protection, the populace breathed freely once more. Despair had given place to hope, and love of country had been kindled in their hearts. In place of the grisly specter of death flamed the radiant image of victory.